Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're actually doing something a little bit different. We're going to look at the very anatomy of an academic study. I want you to think of this almost like examining the architectural blueprint of a house. But, instead of walls and a roof, we are literally deconstructing a real-world PhD advising session to see exactly how high-level financial research is engineered. We've got an exclusive look at a discussion between a PhD student and his advisor, Professor Dr. Narodli, as they map out a super complex study comparing exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, over in Asia. So let's dive right into this and see how a raw idea transforms into a rigorous academic contribution.
Okay, so here's the structural roadmap we're going to follow to build this study from the ground up. First, finding the research gap. Second, defining the core objectives. Third, the theoretical framework. Fourth, methodology and data analysis. And finally, number 5, measuring the contribution.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, finding the research gap, or identifying the void.
So when we put our two main contenders side by side, it's a pretty stark contrast. On one hand, we've got Islamic ETFs. These funds have to strictly follow Sharia-compliant screening. That means heavy investment restrictions, absolutely no gambling, no alcohol, no highly leveraged financial instruments. On the flip side, we have conventional ETFs, which use just standard market screening and have a way broader scope. But here's the crazy part, and this is the exact gap the student zeroed in on. Despite these massive structural differences, there is practically zero comparative performance studies focusing specifically on the Asian market. Everybody looks at the US or Europe. But Asia? A massive, booming growth center for these funds, totally unexplored territory.
Moving on to part 2, defining the core objectives, setting those parameters.
Now that we have our gap, how do we test these ETFs? Well, the student focuses on specific macroeconomic variables. You can kind of think of these as the harsh weather conditions our financial house has to survive. We're talking inflation, interest rates, exchange rates, and overall economic growth, so GDP. The main goal here is to see how differently a strictly screened Islamic ETF reacts to, say, a sudden inflation spike compared to a standard conventional ETF. Like, does one weather the storm better than the other? That is exactly what the data is going to tell us.
But you can't test the whole world at once. You have to draw some borders on your map. And during this advising meeting, a really fascinating hurdle came up about the geographic scope. The student wanted to focus on the Asian 5 markets, but then came the debate, what about emerging, super active markets like Vietnam? Should they be included? It's a classic research dilemma, right? If you include too many totally different countries, your data gets super noisy and impossible to compare. But if you include too few, your study loses its broad relevance. Nailing this scope is absolutely crucial to the integrity of the whole study.
Which brings us to part 3, the theoretical framework. Essentially, building the foundation.
Okay, so during the meeting, the professor and the student throw around some pretty heavy academic jargon. But let's translate that into plain English. The foundation relies on 2 big ideas: arbitrage pricing theory, or APT, and the efficient market hypothesis, EMH. Basically, these established theories are the laws of physics for our blueprint. APT just says you can predict an asset's return by looking at those macro factors we just talked about, like inflation and GDP. EMH, on the other hand, argues that markets are just giant, super-efficient information processors. The second news drops about interest rates, the market instantly adjusts the ETF prices. By anchoring the study to these concepts, the researcher is proving they're building on solid, scientifically proven ground.
All right, part 4, methodology and data analysis. Time to actually test the theory.
So before they even touch a spreadsheet, a PhD student has to actually declare their philosophical stance. I know, it sounds intense. Professor Dr. Narodli specifically guides the student to clarify their ontology and epistemology. In the context of this specific study, positivism and objectivism really just mean the researcher believes the world is made up of objective, measurable facts. There are no subjective interviews here, no feelings. The student is basically declaring, hey, I am relying strictly on cold, hard, quantitative panel data. And here's how that hard data gets put to work in the actual regression equation they map out. It's actually incredibly cool to see how each little Greek letter maps directly to a tangible, real-world financial variable. So, our Y variable, the big thing we're trying to figure out, is ETF performance. To get that, we take our alpha, which is just our baseline, and we add it to a series of betas. Beta 1 maps to liquidity, specifically the trading volume. Beta 2 is the interest rate. Beta 3 is inflation, and beta 4 is the exchange rate. This equation is the literal engine of the study. You plug the Asian market numbers into this mathematical machine, and it tells you exactly which factors are driving the success or failure of these funds.
But obviously, you don't just run that equation once and call it a day. Let's walk chronologically through the rigorous econometric gauntlet the professor outlined. First, you gather your secondary panel data. Then, a unit root test, just to make sure your data is stationary. Next up is the Houseman test, which tells you whether to use fixed or random effects in your model. Then comes the real heavy lifting, running the OLS or GMM regressions. And finally, the goodness of fit test, to see if your model is actually accurate. And let me tell you, as the professor jokingly points out during their chat, surviving these exact, punishing steps without a single mistake is pretty much the only way you're going to survive the wrath of strict PhD examiners during your final defense.
And finally, Part 5, Measuring the Contribution, Assessing the Actual Impact. So we reach the big question, the absolute curb appeal of the whole project. What is the actual novelty of this research? This is where the professor drops his most important piece of advice. He warns the student that a PhD study has to do way more than just crunch numbers through an equation. Anybody can run data. To actually earn that doctorate, your research has to push the boundaries of current theory. It has to give us a completely new lens to view the world through.
And how exactly do they do that? Well, let's look at what Professor Dr. Nuradli suggests. He tells the student, you can think of a contribution to the theory, an adaptive model in between modern portfolio theory and behavioral finance. This is such a brilliant conceptual leap. See, modern portfolio theory is purely math. It assumes investors are just perfect, rational robots trying to maximize returns. But behavioral finance, that acknowledges that we're humans. We're emotional. We panic when inflation spikes. We get greedy during a boom. The professor is literally challenging this student to invent a totally novel, adaptive model that blends the strict, cold math of ETFs with the messy, unpredictable psychology of the actual people trading them.
Which brings us to our final thought. By deconstructing this advising session, we've really seen how researchers methodically isolate variables and apply this intense mathematical scrutiny. But at the very end of the day, past all the formulas and regressions, it all comes back to us, people. When the strict ethical rules of Sharia-compliant ETFs collide with the volatile emotions of a shifting Asian economy, those numbers are only going to tell half the story. The real question this explainer leaves us with is this: how will human behavior ultimately reshape our understanding of these global investments? The math builds the framework for sure, but human psychology is the ultimate test. Thanks so much for joining me today on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.